There are three major threats facing the international aid system. The first is obviously the very deep cuts which have been introduced by the United States, which is the world's largest aid donors. That in itself will take about 45 billion US dollars out of the international aid system. That's around 40% of all aid for public health and for humanitarian aid as well. The second major concern is what we see happening in many countries in Europe, where major donors, in particular the United Kingdom, Germany and France, have been cutting their aid budgets, partly because of domestic budgetary pressure and pressure on public service, high public debt and slower growth. But I think also, more worryingly, because of the rise of extreme right-wing populist perspectives on aid. And I think the third major threat will really come from a failure to address underlying inefficiencies in the aid system. There's far too much aid that's going through very fragmented, very poorly coordinated, small-scale initiatives that generate low impact at high cost. And I think the current funding crisis in aid has given an added urgency to resolving that problem. Well, I think there are many things that need to happen to make the international aid system more effectively. So, for example, to tackle the challenges posed by the fragmentation of aid and the weak coordination of aid, we've seen Brazil, during its presidency of the G20, create this new platform called the Global Alliance Against Hunger and Poverty, the aim of which is to get donors to pool their resources behind shared goals. Now, that sounds like a very general proposition, but what it means is that donors can deliver aid more effectively and at lower cost and generate more outcomes. And in a period of increasing pressure on aid budgets, that's absolutely critical. If you take another area like international humanitarian aid, currently about 90% of all humanitarian aid goes through the United Nations system or large international NGOs. Far more of that support could be going through national civil society organisations which are operating on the front line of humanitarian crises. That would be more efficient, but it would also be more equitable because it would give actors in the global south more of a stake in the financing and the decision-making processes for the international humanitarian system. One thing we can be very clear about is that actors in the global south, both governments and civil society organisations, have argued for a long time that they don't have a sufficient voice in determining aid priorities and also deciding on aid delivery. And far too often we see donors in the global north, who obviously control the aid budgets, also controlling the development agenda in developing countries. We need to move towards an aid system that gives far more autonomy to actors in the global south. Now, that can happen partly through the humanitarian aid reforms that I've already mentioned, but it also needs to happen through governance reforms in the Bretton Woods institutions. It needs to happen through donors directing more of their aid resources through national budgets rather than through small projects which donors themselves control. These are difficult changes to engineer. It's never easy to reform a system, but reform is really urgently overdue.